Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Metro Bethesda Rotary. It's a really great pleasure here. I'm not going to take much time to introduce Ray Suarez. If I read his entire bio, I think I would take up the entire time he's here. So Ray Suarez has a long-standing record of speaking the truth, speaking honestly, and speaking with empathy. And I think that's what we need when we talk about issues like immigration. Ray Suarez is going to tell us about his upcoming TV show, as I think when he introduces himself. I'd rather Ray do that and take less of his time. Ray Suarez, everybody, thank you very much.
For the record, I'm happy too. I'm happy somebody showed up this morning. But if it was just David and Joe, I would have talked just then. But I'm glad that you're all here. As David mentioned, I have a program coming up on PBS in the late spring. It's called Wisdom Keepers. And I get the privilege of spending several hours of national airtime talking to the smartest people I could find about what do we do now, coming out of the pandemic, coming out of years of division and crisis in the country. I've never in my adult life seen it more riven, more divided. And the question is, where do we go from here? And Wisdom Keepers talks to people from various walks of life about how it looks from where they sit and what we should do now. I have a new book out. It's called We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century. And it was delayed, its publication was delayed by the pandemic because the reporting was delayed by the pandemic. People didn't want to meet me in person. Traveling was difficult. Places where you would see people and talk to them about their lives were empty. And my publisher kindly stretched our deadline. And then it came out in the middle of a crisis about immigration in America, which we are in right now. Often, when I'm asked to speak to a group on a specific topic, they're driven by events, but they have a big lead time. So something's really nudging them and they say, oh, let's get that guy. And I say yes, and I come 3 months later, and it feels like the moment has passed. But even with my weather postponed Rotary talk, the situation has only gotten more dire in the intervening months. When I was first invited to talk to you, it was really looking prospectively at what would happen with immigration in America, and now we know. We have a collective cultural memory of immigration that misleads us a little bit about the nonstop movement of people to this country from around the world over the last 250 years. You may remember the celebrations around the centennial of the Statue of Liberty, Ronald Reagan sitting at the base of the statue talking about our immigrant path. You may remember the rehabilitation and reopening of Ellis Island, a wonderful moment and a wonderful landmark in New York Harbor. Depending on your age, you may remember the bicentennial celebrations in 1976. During those times, we were treated to what seemed like thousands of photos, a tour of late 19th and early 20th century photo processing. Sepia tone, tintypes, lovingly curated family photos showing revered and beloved great-great-grandparents looking solemn, as was the photographic fashion of the time. You really never see anybody taking a picture in 1905 and smiling. So these people all look very grave, very serious, very formidable, your great-grandpa, your great-grandma. We love those people. Think about the way we talk about them. Think about the way we have sort of received cultural idea of their role in creating the country that we have today. We love and celebrate those immigrants, but we feel a little less sure today about how we feel as a people about immigrants. In 1965, Congress, supported by LBJ, was empowered by a landslide victory in November 1964. Remember, it was less than a year after the murder of John Kennedy that next election day came. Lyndon Johnson swept into office with enormous majorities in both the House and Senate. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 was quickly signed into law, and the decades of statutory bias toward European immigration ended, and the United States threw its doors open to the rest of the world. Throughout our history, there have always, and when I say all, I mean always been, native-born groups that question the value of immigration and question the legitimacy as part of us of new people from other places. They question whether these new people will ever assimilate, will ever really be like us, will ever really be able to perform the duties of citizens. They're just too different. It was heard in the second half of the 19th century. It was heard in the young 20th century as the labor movement, anarchism, socialism were all part of the national discourse, and now we're finding support in immigrant communities. This suspicion of ideas from outside, politically, socially, culturally, led to the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1924, often called the Johnson-Reed Act. It severely restricted immigration to the United States from anywhere and everywhere, leaving the door open a crack to Western Europe. The 1924 Act got cute with immigration regulation. It included a provision that excluded any alien who, by virtue of race or nationality, could not become a naturalized American. And as I've talked about the book since it came out several months ago, a lot of people have been surprised to find how specific immigration law in the United States had been since the late 19th century about who could come, where they could come from, and who could become a citizen. Legally, written in our law, written in our statutes, people from the Asian continent were largely barred from naturalizing, even if they could get themselves here. They could never become a citizen. And in the book, I talk about one fella, Bhagat Singh Thind, who was a graduate student in the Pacific Northwest, joined the US Army during World War I, and under the provisions of law at the time, was promised citizenship by virtue of that enlistment. That was written into the law too. He went to his local naturalization board and was made a citizen. And then the United States government rescinded his citizenship, took it back and said, sorry, the law says Asians can't become citizens. He didn't take it lying down. He went back, appealed, got his citizenship reinstated, and the US government took it away again. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where it was decided Bhagat Singh Thind, a Sikh, a man from Punjab in Northwest India, simply could not be a US citizen by virtue of the fact that he would not be taken as a white man by a common person on the street. The majority decision in this Supreme Court case was written by an immigrant, but an immigrant from England, who I guess, that's okay. There are all kinds of stories that make up our troubled history around immigration. But I think if you want to distill the thrust down to its real basics, it was the intention of the United States Congress to keep America as white as possible for as long as possible. That 1924 Act closed the door, immigration went down, but then circumstances entered in the form of a worldwide global depression, followed by 10 years of global military conflict. The near panic over the level of foreign born in our society in the early part of the 20th century, which reached 14% in the 1910 census, was answered by law and circumstance, and by 1960, the percentage of foreign-born residents of the United States was down to 5%. We think of immigrants as very present in our society by 1960, but in fact, only 1 of every 20 residents of the country was born somewhere else. A new era of immigration was kicked off by that 1965 act. Johnson got recalcitrant Democrats to vote for the measure by promising them that it wouldn't change America much. Teddy Kennedy was whipping it on the Senate floor and made the same promise to other senators. I can't find out in their papers, in their notes, in their public comments, whether they knew that was wrong and they were just saying it, or whether they really believed that the 1965 Act wouldn't change America much. But it turned out now that we can look over our shoulder at 60 years of the law, it changed America a lot. But one thing that's very different is that now the overwhelming majority of immigrants to the United States are not white. And that's very different from earlier years in our history. And we are processing it, I would suggest, in a different way. The changing racial and ethnic character of the country is immediately visible in a different way, more apparent, even to the casual observer who isn't scanning census data or looking at naturalization applications. You can simply see it while shopping, while commuting, going to your kid's school for open school night or PTA meeting. This book began in a way because of the visible backlash to that new America. I'm sitting at home, living room, watching the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesburg live on television, a long torchlit parade of aggrieved young white men chanting, "You will not replace us." Their assumption that they were the real America and that some vast army of unknown people were going to replace them is a terrible, un-American notion. They believe, those men carrying torches around the statue of Robert E. Lee, believe that America is a zero-sum game, that if somebody else prospers, they have to lose, that there's only a pie that's so big and will never be any bigger. They also chanted ominously, "Jews will not replace us." And a lot of people probably wonder, what are they talking about? There are about 5.5, 6.5 million Jews in the United States, 1.75% of the population. How are they going to replace anybody? Well, online, there's a whole online world, fantasy. And if you look at the Great Replacement Manifesto, you'll find that in elements of the hard right in this country, there is a bedrock belief that American Jewry is behind the changes in laws that allow large numbers of immigrants to come to the United States. And it's part of a grand scheme to replace the previous white Christian majority of the country. So when those young men chant, "Jews will not replace us," it comes from this deeply delusional anti-Semitic theory about what's happening in their own country. Let me make it perfectly, absolutely clear. Every nation on earth has the right to pass or codify laws about the rules for coming here, the rules for staying here, the right to define what hurdles must be cleared for permanent residence and citizenship. What I'm not doing is advocating for unlimited immigration at the option and whim of people everywhere in the world. I need to really make that clear. What I am saying is that the system we have cumbersome, slow, antiquated, expensive, insanely backed up. There are people who have been waiting 10 years and more for a final decision on their process to become legal permanent residents. It's so unwieldy and so hard to navigate that it invites lawbreaking. If we went out to Wisconsin Avenue and made the new speed limit 10 miles an hour, people would speed. And if you pulled them over and you'd say, hey, we caught you going more than 10 miles an hour, you'd say, I can't drive on Wisconsin Avenue at 10 miles an hour. If you make a law too hard to follow, people will be less inclined to follow it. In my view, it's as simple as that. In a world that's changed drastically in recent years, this country has not passed a law debated by Congress, signed by the president, to restructure the operation of immigration in 40 years. When the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 was passed, and yeah, I know it's kind of a drag to think that 1986 was 39 years ago. But that's really a rant for another day, I think. It was passed, signed by Ronald Reagan. Think of the world of 1986. The Cold War was still in full swing. The Soviet Union still existed. Eastern Europe, a source of large numbers of contemporary immigrants to the United States, was still under Soviet control. China was closed. Vietnam was still putting itself together after more than 40 years of nonstop war. Africa was mired in endless proxy war and post-colonial civil war in Somalia, Mozambique, Angola, Congo. South Africa was a practical, sealed tight and about to explode years later. Our cumbersome, antiquated immigration system was not codified to respond to the world as it is today in 2025, but the world as it was. And that might be appropriate because many of the stories we tell ourselves about immigrants seem antiquated as well, about people who never learned English, about people who just come for a handout and don't want to work, who come to sponge off the generosity of a generous and put upon native-born population. We don't talk about the actual 21st century, where the workplace participation rates of immigrants is higher than that of native-born Americans, where acquisition of English is faster than it was in earlier generations. When your Nonna and Nono and Bube and Zede came here, they didn't learn English as fast as today's immigrants are, but we still tell ourselves these lies about them not learning at home. Black America is being transformed. 1 out of every 5 Black people in America is either foreign-born or the child of foreign-born parents from Africa, West Indies, from the English-speaking Caribbean and Latin America. Black people in this country were for decades the most uniformly native-born of all American residents. That makes sense. So few of the 18th and 19th century arrivals could have plausibly been called immigrants or kidnapping. They were brought here in chains to live as property. And in later decades, were well aware of the simmering racial conflict and denial of civil rights. So they steered clear of the United States, but now African immigrants are coming in large numbers from Nigeria, from Liberia, from the Horn of Africa. We talk in a way about the way the American religious landscape is being transformed by immigration. The restrictions and global realities being what they were. In 1960, the United States was almost entirely Christian, with a steady, small percentage of Jews, a tiny Muslim population, which was actually mostly native-born converts from Black communities in Harlem, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, and virtually no Hindus, literally none. 60 years later, with tens of millions of Americans walking away from the religious congregations of their own family history, in this country, with the non-observance and non-affiliation, a steady rise in the number of Muslims from Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and now Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, a polyglot, multiracial Muslim congregation is a feature of community life in the big cities of the Northeast and Great Lakes, but also in less predictable places, in educational hubs, state universities in the South and West. So there are mosques in places, and lots of them, in places like Norman, Oklahoma, and Cedar Falls, Iowa, and Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Hindu temples have joined big box non-denominational Protestant churches on the broad suburban arterial roads in places like northern New Jersey and northern Virginia. And I'll take you in the pages of We Are Home to Frisco, Texas, to one of the biggest Hindu temples I've ever seen. It is Texas, with a multi-acre parking lot, and just jammed. I was there for worship on a Tuesday night. One early winter, I killed time before an afternoon in Minneapolis, for an afternoon appointment in Minneapolis. I sat at a high counter looking out of a window of a Starbucks in the Calhoun Square Mall. A black man in a long overshirt, and a heavy jacket to hold off the early winter wind. His close hair, topped by a knit poofy hat, was stopping passers-by to hand them Muslim literature. He stopped all kinds of people, but seemed to devote special attention to young adult men. Civil war in Somalia had sent people streaming out of that equatorial country in the 1990s, and the frigid Twin Cities became the home of the largest Somali community in the US, some 100,000 strong. As I nursed my coffee and flipped through a magazine, I noticed his approach changed. The assignment no longer seemed to be just pressing leaflets into waiting hands. The tall, broad-shouldered, gregarious street proselytizer had convinced a small group of people to stop windy Hennepin Avenue, and he set them up in 2 rows for afternoon prayer right there on the sidewalk. Asr, one of the 5 appointed prayer times each day for observant Muslims. In unison, men touched their heads to old red brick paving stones in front of the mall. We long kidded about Minnesota in Prairie Home Companion as the home of church suppers and Lutheran choirs and Midwestern Reserve and a kind of unshowy private flavor of religion. And now there were 2 rows of men with their heads bowed on the pavement of Hennepin Avenue. Some shoppers carrying bags from the mall stopped for a moment in respectful silence. This is, after all, Minneapolis. Very polite. Some politely stepped around the kneeling men lined up in short rows on the sidewalk and headed to their next destination. This was only about a decade after 9/11, and I wondered how well such a scene would play in other parts of our big and complicated country. If, after I retire in the next few years, I could head to seminary for a graduate degree, I would watch closely what Americans do. Will they, as immigrants acculturate, as their tenures here in the US lengthen, as their children reach adulthood and have their own children, will they become religiously more like their native-born neighbors, that is, falling away from family observance? Or will they remain somewhat distinct and keep the faith that they came with to the United States? They could disaffiliate at a similar level to native-born Americans, even as they carry a set of distinctive facial features and skin tones into their future, while not carrying their ancestral faith. It could mean over time converting. One of the people I profile in the book is an Ethiopian church deacon. His youngest congregants are no longer as familiar with the separate liturgical language used in Ethiopian worship. So he has to do 1 sermon a month in English. Will they marry out and join similar but more American congregations? that worship in England? Will they marry Black Americans and become Baptists or members of AME congregations? A Hindu mother of 2 college-age sons said she thought both of her boys will marry in the faith, and if they don't, will still remain Hindu. Her confidence is buoyed by the families she sees at Temple, with intermarried couples where both parents are encouraging their children in Hindu learning. Will a particularly American style of Islam grow in this country? One where more of the preaching and teaching goes on in English, even as Arabic prayer remains central. In what ways will Muslim families resemble Roman Catholic families early in the 20th century, who built churches, brought in priests and nuns from faraway countries to keep a bit of Croatia, Poland, Italy, Ireland alive in church, and then find that just can't bridge across to the 21st century. Compared to the immigrant population of 1960, today's immigrant population is younger, more heavily concentrated in the school and workforce years, and more educated than immigrants of any earlier generation. Unlike the stereotype of handout seekers, adults born outside the United States have a higher workforce participation rate, lower unemployment. That post-1965 set of immigrants is more heavily Latin American than the country as a whole, contributing to the enormous growth of the Latino population, but East Asians and South Asians now outnumber Latinos as new arrivals to the United States. So when you're at Costco, take a look at each of the aisles with. But I guess more than anything else this morning, I was very heartened and encouraged when I'm not familiar with Rotary, but when I saw these values laid out in your opening this morning. I mean, these are some of the questions that we should ask ourselves in the current ongoing debates, passionate debates about the immigrant future of the United States, about the truth and fairness, goodwill and friendships, and beneficial nature. We are going at this the wrong way. The discourse is way off track, and we are not asking ourselves about the benefit to the United States. When you walk back to the parking structure, for those of you parking on the street, keep an ear out for the crew that's rebuilding Cordell Avenue and see if you can follow their conversation. Some of you may. I'll leave it there. I have books if you are interested in acquiring a copy of We Are Home. And it was great to see you all, and I'm glad I wasn't here by myself. Thank you.
Thank you so much.